It started with whispers, odd patterns, officers seen in the wrong places, paperwork that didn't line up. But by the time Operation Shattered Shield was over, those whispers had turned into a federal storm and 20 law enforcement officers were in handcuffs. What federal agents uncovered wasn't a few isolated incidents or lapses in judgment. It was a full-blown criminal enterprise rooted inside law enforcement, and not just in one town.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
Town or one department. This was multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional, and tied directly to two of the most dangerous cartels in the world, Sinaloa and CJ&G. The people involved weren't outsiders. They were community officers, people who had sworn to protect and serve. They were the same ones who patrolled neighborhoods, spoke at schools, and responded to 911 calls. And behind that badge, they were moving drugs and money for cartel traffickers. The investigation took almost 3 years. The FBI and DEA were methodical. They didn't just want arrests, they needed undeniable proof. So they gathered encrypted communications, intercepted financial documents, compiled over 50 hours of covert recordings and video footage. And what they found was staggering. These officers were not just covering for traffickers. They were active participants in a $3.4 million pipeline. Police vehicles were used to escort cartel shipments. Official cruisers paid for with public money were driven along back roads, creating a moving shield of legitimacy that allowed drugs to pass through checkpoints unnoticed. Fake contracts, shell companies, and falsified documentation were created to mask the movement of funds. On paper, everything looked clean. In practice, it was a high-functioning criminal machine hiding in plain sight. This wasn't sloppy or rushed. It was precise, strategic, built to last. But it didn't. When federal agents launched coordinated raids, they hit homes, police departments, and front companies at the same time. It was a tactical takedown executed with precision. Because once that level of corruption is exposed, there's no room for error. The people being arrested weren't just dirty, they were trained, armed, and embedded in the system. The risk was real. And the fallout hit fast. Communities were blindsided. These weren't nameless, faceless criminals, they were familiar. Local heroes turned cartel operatives. Officers people had grown up with, trusted, waved to at stop signs. The betrayal was personal. And that betrayal doesn't go away when the handcuffs click. This case didn't just expose a criminal operation. It exposed a massive institutional failure. Because corruption this deep doesn't thrive in a vacuum, it needs weak oversight, ignored red flags, and systems willing to look the other way. The internal protections that should have caught this didn't. Audits weren't deep enough. Supervision wasn't tight enough. Accountability mechanisms were either missing or ignored. And that gave the cartels exactly what they needed: access. Not through violence, but through relationships, vulnerability, and quiet complicity. The most disturbing part: this wasn't a temporary lapse. It was sustained, organized. Officers didn't just go rogue. They were part of an ongoing structure. And the deeper investigators looked, the more ties they found. To private security companies, to financial intermediaries, even to figures with political connections. This wasn't just a policing issue, it was systemic. That's why the aftermath went beyond arrests. It had to. Federal and state agencies began overhauling their own structures. Oversight bureaus were established. New integrity task forces were launched. Internal auditing protocols were written. In some areas, entire units were reassigned or shut down altogether. Because cleaning up after a betrayal of this scale means starting over in some cases. And that reform wasn't optional. It was survival. Because once law enforcement loses credibility, everything else starts to crumble. The courts, the prisons, the patrols, the community programs, they all rely on trust. And this case shattered it. When people saw officers being hauled out of their own precincts by federal agents, it didn't just send a message. It rewrote expectations. Trust had to be earned again, from zero. But the bigger lesson wasn't just about the individuals arrested, it was about the system that let them operate. The investigation made it clear, organized crime isn't just violent, it's adaptive. It doesn't always come in the form of shootouts and smuggling routes. Sometimes it comes in a handshake, a badge, a contract signed behind closed doors, Cartels exploit weakness. They look for silence, fatigue, and complacency. That's why this case matters far beyond Mississippi. Because every institution that relies on unchecked authority is a potential target. And if this could happen in small-town precincts where everyone knows everyone, it can happen anywhere. It's also a wake-up call for policymakers. Strengthening law enforcement isn't just about funding or weapons. It's about ethics, oversight, transparency. It's about creating systems where corruption can't hide, not just hoping it doesn't. That's why the operation's success wasn't just the takedown. It was the structural reflection that followed. Departments were forced to confront their weaknesses, re-examine their hiring practices, and put systems in place to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Because here's the reality. The next infiltration won't look the same. It won't follow the same playbook. It'll be smarter, more subtle. It might come through a digital backdoor, a private partnership, a contractor with just enough clearance and just enough deniability. That's why vigilance is everything. Not just from the top but from within. Officers watching officers. Citizens watching systems. Transparency not as a talking point, but as policy, as a standard. And the role of community. It matters more than ever. Because corruption thrives in silence. In institutions that operate behind closed doors, with no accountability to the people they claim to serve. When communities demand transparency, when they participate, when they stay informed, that's when these networks have nowhere to hide. Operation Shattered Shield wasn't just a case. It was a turning point. It showed us exactly what happens when oversight fails and exactly what's possible when agencies actually work together to tear corruption out from the roots. But it also made one thing painfully clear. The shield doesn't just protect the public. It protects those within the system too. And when it gets infiltrated, it stops being a shield at all. If this case struck a nerve, or if you've seen the signs of corruption in your own city, drop a comment below. Your voice matters. What shook you most about the story? What do you think needs to change? Like, if you believe integrity in law enforcement isn't optional, it's essential. Share this video if you know someone who still thinks institutional betrayal is just a few bad apples. And subscribe for more breakdowns that expose the cracks in systems we're told to trust. Because as long as crime can wear a badge, we have a duty to keep shining a light before the next shield shatters. And if you're still trying to process how something like this could even happen in the first place, how 20 officers, many of them long-standing members of their communities, ended up working hand in hand with international cartels, you're not alone. That's what makes this so disturbing. These weren't strangers sneaking in from the outside. These were insiders. Uniformed, salaried, respected. They didn't need to break into the system, they were the system. That's what Operation Shattered Shield forced everyone to confront. The enemy wasn't outside the gates. It was already wearing the badge. For years, they moved drugs and money under the protection of law enforcement authority. They had access to intelligence, to resources, to roads cleared of suspicion. They weren't just looking the other way, they were paving the way. Official police vehicles were used to run escort missions for cartel shipments. Cruisers with flashing lights weren't pulling traffickers over, they were shielding them from the law. And when people say, how could this happen? The better question is, how couldn't it? Because it wasn't just about greed. It was about access, about opportunity, about institutional weakness so severe that it created the perfect ecosystem for this kind of corruption to grow quietly. Ghost contracts were filed to provide cover for illegal movements. Shell companies were created to move millions in illicit funds without a trace. Legitimate businesses were used to hide dirty money in clean ledgers. It wasn't messy. It wasn't reckless. It was smart, cold, strategic. And let's be real, that's what makes it terrifying. Because what this case revealed is that law enforcement without strong internal controls can be flipped. It doesn't take an invasion. It takes exploitation of broken systems and blind spots, weak oversight, loopholes, and the assumption that once you put on a uniform, your intentions will never be questioned again. That's how they got away with it for years. Some of these officers were trusted to the point of reverence. They were at community events, local parades, charity drives. Meanwhile, they were running protection for multi-million-dollar cartel operations, trafficking drugs, laundering money, using forged documents to cover their tracks, all under the guise of official duty. This wasn't a side hustle. It was a second career built on corruption. And when the hammer came down, the scope was broader than anyone expected. 20 individuals were taken down, 14 of them still active or recently retired law enforcement. But what the investigation revealed was that the network went way beyond the badge. There were ties to private security firms, to intermediaries with political influence, even to people in administrative roles who helped cover up the financial side. That's why this case didn't stay small. It had to go federal. Because this wasn't just a criminal conspiracy, it was a structural one. And the scale of what was uncovered, it demands we stop pretending this was isolated. Because this kind of infiltration isn't unique to Mississippi. It's what happens when organized crime evolves faster than the institutions designed to stop it. When cartels don't need violence because they've mastered manipulation. When the roadblocks to corruption are so thin, you don't even need to break them, you just walk right through. Federal agencies responded with a level of precision you don't usually see outside of national security operations. The raids were coordinated across multiple sites, homes, police departments, business fronts. Search warrants were executed simultaneously to prevent leaks. Tactical teams moved in while forensic teams began seizing records and digital evidence. It was swift and deliberate because they knew what they were dealing with wasn't just a group of corrupt individuals. It was a compromised system. And here's the part that should haunt every law enforcement agency watching. The officers involved knew the system. They knew what reports would be flagged. They knew what paperwork would pass inspection. They knew which loopholes would hold up just enough to avoid internal review. That's why they weren't afraid. For years, the system protected them until it didn't. But after the shock, after the arrests, came the part that everyone dreads: rebuilding. Community trust isn't something you can flip back on. It takes years to establish and seconds to destroy. When people watched those officers get marched out of their own precincts, it wasn't just a legal story. It was emotional, psychological. Residents started questioning everything, every traffic stop, every investigation, every time a siren went off in their neighborhood. Because when the protectors become the predators, what's left? That's why reform couldn't just be symbolic. It had to be structural. Internal audits were restructured. Entire oversight departments were created or expanded. Financial tracking tools were implemented for officers with access to sensitive assets. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. Background checks were revisited even on existing employees. Because what Operation Shattered Shield revealed wasn't just a problem. It was a blueprint of how institutional integrity can be quietly dismantled from the inside and how difficult it is to detect until it's too late. And the implications go further. What other systems could be compromised? What if the same vulnerabilities exist in corrections, in procurement, in political offices? Organized crime doesn't limit itself to drug routes. It follows power. And wherever that power is poorly guarded, it moves in. That's why vigilance isn't optional. It's essential. Corruption doesn't wait for permission. It waits for opportunity. And when trust is assumed rather than enforced, it becomes a liability. This case should be a national training module. Not just for law enforcement, but for every institution that holds public power. Because it shows, with devastating clarity, what happens when no one's watching the watchers. But here's the other lesson: exposure works. Operation Shattered Shield didn't start with noise. It started with careful work. With investigations that stayed quiet long enough to gather undeniable evidence. With agents who refused to be intimidated. With agencies willing to work together across jurisdictions to tear out the problem by the roots. That kind of effort needs to be the standard, not the exception. Because organized crime isn't slowing down. It's evolving. And if law enforcement doesn't evolve with it, we're just waiting for the next scandal, the next takedown, the next headline that reads like a movie plot except it's all real. So here's the question. What are we going to do with this moment? Are we going to use it as a turning point? Or are we going to let it fade, file it away as just another case until the cycle repeats? Because the shield cracked in Mississippi. But what we do next determines whether it shatters everywhere else. Operation Shattered Shield didn't just expose corruption. It redefined it. Because when the people enforcing the law become the cover for organized crime, we're no longer talking about misconduct. We're talking about a collapse in the chain of trust between law enforcement and the communities they swear to protect. Let's be clear, this wasn't about one or two rogue officers making bad decisions. This was 20 individuals, many of them in active service, working directly with some of the most dangerous cartels on the continent. Not under threat, not by force, willingly, for profit, with strategy, over years. And the tools they used weren't street-level weapons or high-tech hacking gear. They used paperwork, uniforms, contracts, squad cars. They used the credibility of their titles to become invisible and touchable. And until someone at the federal level said enough, they were succeeding. These weren't street hustlers getting lucky. They were part of an actual business model, a trafficking pipeline hidden inside police operations, funded by drug money, and protected by the perception that the badge makes you immune to suspicion. That's the most chilling part. It worked because people trusted them. Because no one wants to believe that the officer they see at church or on the school run could be escorting narcotics across state lines. That's why it went on for years. That's why no one noticed until someone finally did. When the arrests went public, the narrative shifted from shock to fear. People didn't just wonder who else might be involved. They started to question whether anyone in uniform could be fully trusted. And that ripple effect doesn't end when the headlines do. Trust is fragile. And once it's broken at the institutional level, every future interaction is loaded with doubt. Every officer gets side-eyed. Every traffic stop feels like a question mark. And it's not just the communities who suffer, it's the good officers, too. The ones who are actually doing their jobs with integrity now have to wear the consequences of a betrayal they had no part in. That's the damage that can't be measured in arrests or seized assets. It's measured in lost faith, in public silence, in the widening distance between the people and those paid to protect them. And while reforms are being implemented, oversight bureaus, audit procedures, restructuring, that doesn't mean the danger's over. If anything, the lesson here is that these systems were too easy to exploit. Too many doors were left unlocked. Too many gaps went unmonitored. And cartels, being what they are, didn't just walk in, they were welcomed by the absence of resistance. That's why this can't be treated as a closed case. Because organized crime learns too. And if the conditions that made this possible aren't fixed, this won't be the last time. It'll just be the last time we catch it. So now the question isn't just how did this happen? It's what's actually being done to make sure it doesn't happen again. Because systemic corruption doesn't get solved with press conferences and policy handbooks. It gets solved with unrelenting accountability, with external audits, with protections for whistleblowers, with leadership that doesn't just chase PR wins but demands transparency, even when it's uncomfortable, and with a public that refuses to look away. If you followed this story, you know it's more than just a crime ring. It's a blueprint for what failure looks like when we stop paying attention. And if we want to prevent the next Operation Shattered Shield, we need to remember this one loudly. Let us know how this story hit you. Were you shocked by the scope? Did it change how you view law enforcement? Share your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if you believe trust has to be earned and protected. Share this video if you know someone who still thinks this kind of corruption could never happen here. And subscribe if you want to stay informed about the real stories behind the systems we live with every day. Because the shield may have cracked, but what we do next decides whether it breaks or gets rebuilt stronger than before.